I'm honored to introduce Steve Snyder. He is the author of the book Shot Down. He has them in the back for sale, by the way, which I'm pretty sure most of you will want to get after you see his presentation. It's a true story of his father, the pilot Howard Snyder, and the crew of the B-17 Susan Ruth during World War II. Shot Down recounts the dramatic experiences of each member of the B-17 crew after their plane was knocked out of the sky by German fighters over the French-Belgium border in February 8, 1944. Their individual stories and those of the courageous Belgian people who risked their lives to help them are all different, all remarkable, and painstakingly researched by Steve through personal letters, oral and written accounts, declassified military documents, and interviews, all from the people who took part in the events that happened over 70 years ago. He even interviewed the German Luftwaffe pilot who shot down the Susan Ruth. So signed copies will be available at the end. He'll be staying afterwards to talk with you, and his table is in the back, and to sign any copies of books that you'd like to take. I've read it. It's a fabulous book. It moves very quickly, and it's very heartwarming to learn about the Belgium underground in a way I never knew they existed. So without further ado, as it says, let me introduce Steve Snyder.
Thank you very much, Sue. What a great venue. Guys, this is just fantastic, and what a crowd. This is just fabulous. I've made quite a few presentations, but I think this is the biggest audience that I've had. So, and I couldn't be more honored to be with so many, here with so many veterans today. So I thank you for your service to our country. God bless you, and God bless America. Growing up, I knew about my dad's World War II history. He was a B-17 pilot. He was stationed in England with the 8th Air Force. His plane was named the Susan Ruth after my oldest sister, who was 1 year old at the time that he went overseas. He flew bombing missions over Europe. On February 8th of 1944, his plane was shot down by enemy fighters, and he was missing in action for 7 months, but he evaded capture and eventually made it back to England. But it wasn't until I retired that I actually had the time to really delve into my dad's war history in more detail. And my parents had kept a lot of material from the war years. I just wanted to go through that and maybe find out some new things. And there were 2 items that were really significant. One was a diary that my dad wrote while he was missing in action about his plane being shot down, which is absolutely riveting. So much so that it was included in 2 books that were written on the left. It was The Mighty Eight by Gerald Asper. It's about the 8th Air Force that flew high-altitude, daylight precision bombing missions over Europe. And the goal was to hit industrial and military targets to cripple Nazi Germany's ability to wage war. Their first mission was on August 17, 1942. And the 8th Air Force got the moniker the Mighty Eighth by noted historian Roger Freeman for the number of planes and bombers they could put up on missions, which numbered into the hundreds. And on December 24th of 1944, 2,000 bombers hit targets around Berlin. So that's a bomber stream of about 300 miles, and it's hard to even comprehend what that must have looked like. The other book was First Over Germany by Russell Strong. It was about the 306 bomb route that my dad was in. Russell Strong was a navigator in the 306 and became its historian after the war. And the motto of the 306 was First Over Germany because they were the first bomb group in the 8th Air Force to hit a target in Germany, Wilhelmshaven, on January 27th of 1943. The other item of significance were all the letters that my dad had written to my mother while he was stationed in England before being shot down. And he was very candid in these letters. He talked about what bombing missions were like, what life was like on the air base, what life was like in England, London at the time, escapades of him and his crew, and I was fascinated reading those letters, and I became fascinated with the story of my dad and his crew, and it became my passion. I started reading book after book about the air war over Europe. I went on the internet and spent countless hours doing research, downloading declassified military documents. I found relatives of all my dad's crew and asked them for whatever information they could give to me. Started going to reunions and listening to veterans tell their stories. And finally, 3 years into my research, I just came to the conclusion that the story of my dad and his crew was so unique and so compelling that it needed to be told. So I decided to write a book. It took me 4.5 years from the time I started my research to the time the book was published. And to print the hardcover book, I actually formed my own publishing company called Seabreeze Publishing, which is the name of the street that I live in. I live on Seal Beach, California. The first half of the book builds up to the day that the plane was shot down, and then the second half of the book is all about what happens afterwards on the ground. And it's just not about my dad, but it goes into detail about what happened to each member of the crew and about all the Belgian people that risked their lives trying to help them. But I couldn't have written the book if it wasn't for two Belgian gentlemen. On the left, with my dad, who's wearing his bomber jacket, is Dr. Paul Delahaye. That picture was taken in 1994, the 50th anniversary of the liberation of Belgium and my dad's plane being shot down. And then to the right, with me, is Jacques Below. That was 20 years later, the 70th anniversary. These men were young boys during the war, and they were greatly affected by it. They saw firsthand atrocities committed by the Nazis against their families and friends, and later on in life, they became local historians. And they interviewed all these Belgian people and members of the Belgian underground about events involving my dad and his crew, and they documented their testimony. And they gave me a wealth of unbelievable, detailed information that would have been lost forever without their dedicated research. So I owe them a huge debt. Initially, my dad didn't go into the Air Force as a result of the first peacetime draft in history implemented by Franklin Roosevelt in September of 1940. My dad went into the Army, and he was stationed at Fort Lewis, Washington. And at the beginning of World War II, the U.S. military was woefully weak. They ranked 18th in military strength in the world, behind Romania. And they're very ill-equipped, too, as you can see by the World War I uniform that my dad has on here. A few months later, he married Ruth Hempel at First Lutheran Church in Pasadena, California. My mother was born and raised in Pasadena, as was I. It was shortly after she graduated from UCLA, where she was a classmate of the legendary Jackie Robinson. I also went to UCLA, and my classmates at UCLA was Lou Alcindor, Kareem Abdul. My dad was born in Norfolk, Nebraska, and then he moved with his family prior to starting high school. A few months later, on December 7th, a date which will live in infamy, Pearl Harbor was bombed by Japan and the United States was at war. Well, my mother was very fearful. The future was very uncertain, so she decided to go up to Washington and visit my dad over Christmas. And 9 months later, Susan Ruth was born. Well, my dad's thinking, gosh, I have this new family, a new bride, and a baby on the way, and he didn't think he could support him very well in the Army on a private's pay. So he decided to volunteer for the Air Force so he could make more money, especially if he could go become a pilot and become an officer. So in June of 1942, we went through pre-flight training at Santa Ana Army Air Base in Southern California. And there they kind of weeded the cadets out. There was a lot of physical training, military discipline, and they had a lot of different tests to see if they were qualified to go into pilot training or not. And then they went through the various stages of pilot training. And this slide's pretty busy and hard to read, but there were 3 main stages to become a pilot. The first was primary training, which my dad went through in Santa Maria, California. And pilot training was tough, both mentally and physical. Not only the physical training, but they had to take all sorts of classes in aerodynamics and calculus and physics and meteorology. So they had to be smart as well to get through this. And 40% of the cadets that started in pilot training washed out. And they either became bombardiers, navigators, or maybe gunners. If you passed primary, you went into basic pilot training. Then after basic, they separated the pilots out, and they either went into, up on the top here, you can see, either went into single-engine planes, which were fighters, or they split out and went to twin-engine planes, which resulted in being bombers or transports. Typically shorter pilots wanted to be fighters because of the cramped conditions in the cockpit. My dad was 6'3", so they put him into bombers. But I think personally it also depended on the personality of the pilots. But from my experience, it seems to me that fighter pilots tend to have big egos, be cocky, risk takers, more individualistic, where the bomber pilots tended to be a little more level-headed and team players. That always gets a comment. Here you see my dad in primary training. This was a huge day for him. It was the first time he ever soloed. And back then, you couldn't wear your goggles on top of your helmet until you was soloing. You see him smoking there. I think almost everyone smoked back in those days. Here you see the three types of planes that flew in pilot training. Up top there in primary, flew a Spearman biplane, and then in basic, a multi-valiant single-wing plane. And then in advanced training, he flew a Curtiss-Wright 18-9 twin-engine plane. He graduated from pilot training, advanced pilot training in Douglas, Arizona in April of 1943, where he earned his commission as a second lieutenant in his pilot's wings. And from there he went to Pio, Texas, where he learned how to fly a four-engine B-17 bomber. Then from there he went to Dalhart, Texas for operational crew training, where the various members of the crew came together and they learned to operate as a team, and then deemed ready, they were assigned overseas to the European Theater of Operations. On October 21st of 1943, my dad and his crew reported the 306 bomb group in Thurlow, England, which is about 60 miles north of London. This is what the base looked like back then. It's no longer there, but there's still some T2 hangars there and some dilapidated buildings, but there is a nice little museum that I visited several times. This is the insignia of the 306 bomb group. In the 8th Air Force, there were 3 air divisions. And the 306 was in the 1st Air Division, which was signified by a triangle. And then every bomb group had a designated letter, and for the 306, it was H. So a triangle H signified the 306 bomb group. In addition to being the first bomb group to hit a target in Germany, they were also the longest serving bomb group in the 8th Air Force. They stayed on until December of 1946, involved in the Casey Jones project, which was the aerial photo mapping of Western Europe and Northern Africa. General Eisenhower was so disgusted with the maps that were available at that time, because the Army was getting lost all the time trying to find their way around, so he wanted to have better maps going forward. Probably many of you have seen the 1949 movie 12 O'Clock High starring Gregory Peck. That was based on a true story about the 306 bomb group. The fictitious bomb group in the movie, the 918th, was derived by multiplying the 306 by 3. Another distinction that 306 had was that the flight surgeon, Dr. Thurman Schuler, was responsible for convincing 8th Bomber Command Commander Ira Aker to implement a mission limit. Up until that time, there was no mission limit, and the morale of his combat crews was going into the tank because they realized they would never ever make it home. They would either be killed or be shot down and become prisoners of war. Sherman suggested a mission limit of 20, 8% of the 25, but at least they had a light at the end of the tunnel and a goal to shoot for of possibly making it back home to their loved ones. Every bomb group had 4 bomb squadrons in the upper left. The 367, their nickname was the Clay Pigeons because they took such horrendous losses during the war. My dad was in the 369th in the lower right, the Fighting Bite. I always like to point out the ground crews. The combat crews got all the glory and recognition, but these ground crews that kept these planes flying. After bombing missions, they'd come in and these ground crews would stay up all through the night, usually in very inclement weather, rain, sleet, snow, mud, doing damage repairs, maintenance on the plane, replacing engines, tires, flight controls. And they took great pride in these planes that they took care of. And they thought, considered it their plane, that he just loaned out to combat crews occasionally to fly missions. So they were really the unsung heroes. Here you see my dad's crew of B-17 had a 10-man crew. In front of the 4 officers. On the lower left is my dad. was the first pilot and as such the commander of the crew and the plane. He was the only crew member that was lived west of the Mississippi. All the others lived east of the Mississippi. And then going across, you had the co-pilot, the navigator, and the bombardier. And then standing behind them were 6 enlisted men, or non-commissioned officers, who were mainly gunners. 5 of these men came home, but 5 did not. That's not the Susan Ruth that they're standing in front of. That's just another B-17 that they took their crew pictures with. And on the upper left, you'll see the nose art. I love the nose art. It's interesting that the Air Force was the only entity that allowed their planes to be painted. The Navy didn't, the Army didn't, nor the other countries. But the Air Force thought it would help the morale of these young guys if they could personalize their planes. And they were very creative in what they named their planes and painted on their planes. A lot of times it was a cartoon character, but more often than not, it was a scantily clad and nude woman. You know, after all, these guys were in their late teens and early 20s and were barely young men. The 306 bomb group flew B-17s. In the 8th Air Force, the 1st Air Division and the 3rd Air Division flew B-17s, and the 2nd Air Division flew B-24 Liberators. The B-17 was nicknamed the Flying Fortress because of the armament they had on the planes. There were 13 50 caliber machine guns. They could put out a tremendous amount of firepower, and also they could take a tremendous amount of battle damage. Every plane had tail markings to identify them. And here again, you'll see the triangle H of the 306 bomb group, and then they had an identification number that was assigned by the manufacturer. The Boeing company designed the B-17 and produced 60% of them, but Douglas Aircraft and Lockheed Vega each built 20% as well. There were 3 different models of B-17s flown in the European theater of operations. The first was the E model, but he only built about 500 of those, so it was quickly phased out by the F model. And then in the fall of 1943, the F model was started being phased out by the definitive model, the G model. You can always tell the G model by the chin turret underneath the nose. Here you see the crew positions on the plane. Again, this is the G model with the chin turret. There in the nose, up front, you had the bombardier. Behind the bombardier, the navigator. And above them were the 2 pilots, the first pilot and the co-pilot. Then you had the flight engineer, and then the bomb bay. And the bombs hung up on racks in the bomb bay. You can see how tight it is. It's tighter, more cramped than a B-17 than it was in a submarine. If you've never been in one, it's hard to visualize how tight it is. This boy is 8 years old, and that catwalk's 8 inches wide, so you can see how tight that is. And occasionally on bomb runs, these bombs would get hung up on those racks, which would require one of the crewmen to either kick it loose with his foot or take a wrench and knock it loose. And when those bomb bay doors are open, you're looking 5 miles straight down to the ground, so that took a little courage. Here you see the crew positions a little clear. This is the F model without the chin turret. There again, you have the bombardier and the nose, and his main job was to drop the bombs accurately. But in the G model, he manned the chin turret when they were under attack by enemy fighters. Then you have the navigator next to him or behind him. He needed to know where they were and where they were going. And when under attack, he manned the cheek guns that were on each side of the nose of the plane. Then you had the 2 pilots, as I mentioned, the first pilot in the left seat, co-pilot in the right seat. And you needed 2 pilots to fly these planes, and not just because if one got killed or injured, you had another guy that could do the job. But it was very strenuous, both mentally and physically, to fly these planes. Their missions lasted between 6 to 10 hours, so it was very lengthy, and back then it took muscle to fly these old planes. And they flew in tight formation, so they had to stay alert, or else they could clip a wing on the plane next to them, or run into the plane in front of them and go down. They continually had to fight air turbulence. Naturally, they had the weather turbulence they had to fight that, we all know about. But they also had the turbulence of all those bombers being in such close proximity to one another. So the wake turbulence and the prop wash would just churn the air up. And, you'd really have to hold on to that yoke to avoid running into another plane. And then behind the co-pilots, you had the flight engineer, the pilots, you had the flight engineer. He manned the top turret when they were under attack. He was also called the crew chief. He was kind of like an onboard mechanic that knew how everything worked and could perform maintenance. And he also helped monitor all the instruments that were in the cockpit. There were over 150 different gauges, toggles, dials, and switches. And he would peer over the pilot's shoulders to help monitor engine performance and fuel consumption. Then behind the bomb bay, you had the radio operator. That was the most comfortable position on the plane. He had a relatively roomy compartment and a chair to sit at. And then below him, the most cramped position on the plane, the ball turret gunner. Again, these missions were 6 to 10 hours in length, so he's in that field position for hours on end. It's pretty uncomfortable. Then above the ball, you had the two waist gunners, which is the most exposed position on the plane, and another very cramped position in the tail gunners. My dad flew his first mission on November 3rd of 1943 to Wilhelmshaven. It was the first time they put up over 500 bombers on a mission. Flying combat was brutal and extremely dangerous. There were 26,000 men that were killed in the 8th Air Force, which was more than all the Marine Corps fighting in the Pacific. Another 28,000 men became prisoners of war after their bombers were knocked out of the sky. Being a combat crewman in the 8th Air Force during World War II was the most dangerous duty assignment in the United States military. And it was dangerous from the time they took off to the time they landed. There were 40 bomb groups located in England in an area called East Anglia, which is about the size of Vermont. And these bases are located about 5 to 10 miles apart. So the day of a mission, you could have hundreds of bombers all taken off at the same time. And back then, there was no air traffic control, there was no radar. Usually the weather was socked in and overcast, and you couldn't see anything until you got above the cloud layer. So mid-air collisions were not uncommon. Then they had to form up. Individual planes formed up into 3-plane elements formed up into bomb squadrons formed up into bomb groups formed up into combat wings formed up into air divisions, and all this took an hour to 2 hours before they could even start their mission across the English Channel. Then they had to deal with the elements. These planes were pressurized, so above 10,000 feet they had to go on oxygen, or else they'd pass out in a couple of minutes and die. And also, it was very cold at the altitudes they were flying. It was minus 40 to 60 degrees below zero. So frostbite was a huge problem, and one of my dad's waist gunners was in the hospital for 2.5 months because of the seriousness of his frostbite injuries. Here you see the combat uniform they wore when they went on missions. This is the tail gunner. That happens to be a B-24 Liberator who's standing in front of a B-17. But you see his steel helmet, his tail goggles, his oxygen mask, and he's wearing a flak jacket. That's an apron with metal plates in the front and back to help protect him. And his fleece-lined jacket and pants and thermal gloves and boots, and the white strap around his waist, that was a parachute harness. They didn't actually wear their parachutes in the plane because it was too cramped. So if they had to bail out, they had to have their wits about them to find their parachute in the first place, and then clip it on hooks on the back of the harness and then bail out. Here you see a waist gunner, again, firing his 50 caliber machine gun, because the next thing they had to deal with was enemy fighters. The Germans had radar stations set up along the continental coast of Europe, so they knew any bomber formations were coming, and they'd send their Air Force up, the Luftwaffe, to intercept them. Again, you see all these spent cartridges on the ground there. It's like stepping on ball bearings or marbles. And the 50 caliber machine guns, the ammunition came in belts that were 27 feet in length. So if he fired the whole belt, they said he fired the whole 9 yards, and that's what a lot of people believe that expression came from. At the beginning of the air war, it was 8th Bomber Command's belief that these heavily armed bombers flying in tight formations of hundreds of bombers could defend themselves from the Luftwaffe. And they flew what's called a combat box formation. And this is the combat box of the combat wing. And then within the wing, you have 3 combat boxes representing bomb groups. And then within each bomb group, you have 3 boxes representing bomb squadrons. So the thought was all this interlacing firepower would ward off the Germans, but sadly that was not the case. In the early years of the war, the 8th Air Force took devastating losses, particularly in 1943. And even though they implemented that mission limit of 21 in April of that year, it was statistically impossible to complete 25 missions. The average number of missions flown in 1943 was 6. And the losses culminated in October that year, what was referred to as Black Week. When over 4 missions, they lost 148 bombers. That's almost 1,500 men. The worst day was October 14th, referred to as Black Thursday, when they sent 221 B-17s to hit the ball bearing factories at Schweinfurt, Germany, and 60 were shot down. 600 men. 10 of the 15 B-17s that the 306 put up that day were shot down. Well, the 8th Air Force was in shock. There's no way that they could sustain those losses, so they discontinued flying into Germany for the remainder of the year. It wasn't until external fuel tanks were added to the P-47 Thunderbolts and the introduction of the P-51 Mustang at the beginning of 1944 that they finally had fighters that could escort them all the way deep into Germany and escort them back again. Here you see another view of the formation from the front, from on top, and then from the side. It was a three-dimensional formation with a lead group, a high group, and a low group. The P-51 Mustangs were really affected. By the time D-Day came around on June 6th of 44, they had just decimated the Luftwaffe, and the Allies had complete air supremacy. Here you see a P-51 Mustang. I don't know if anyone could recognize that, but that belongs to Tom Cruise, and that he flew in Top Gun Maverick. And that's stored most of the time at the Planes of Fame Air Museum that Sue mentioned a little while ago. The next thing they had to deal with was anti-aircraft fire. This is a flak gun. Flak was an abbreviation for the German word for aircraft defense cannon. And these were deadly weapons. They fired 20 shells a minute, and they were calibrated to explode at the same altitude that the bomber formations were flying. And these shells were filled with all different shapes and sizes of razor-sharp metal, referred to as shrapnel. And when these shells exploded, they burst out hundreds of feet and easily penetrate the thin aluminum skin of these bombers. The skin of these bombers are so thin you can take a screwdriver and just poke it right through it. From a distance, they looked like innocent black puffs, but when you got into that killing field, those puffs got bigger, the explosions became deafening. If a shell exploded near a bomber, it would just violently rock the ship. If a bomber was hit directly, it would just basically disintegrate and disappear. Or if it hit a wing, that bomber would just plummet to the earth. My dad said even though it was so cold at the altitude that they were flying, he would just be sweating profusely and the clothes would be wringing wet with the adrenaline running through his body. When they neared the target, they reached a predetermined point called the initial point, or IP, and that's when they started their bomb run. And at that time, the first pilot would give control over the plane to the bombardier, who would fly the plane from the Norden bomb site. It was a revolutionary device. It was an analog computer that could calculate various factors such as the speed of the plane, the height the plane was flying, wind speed, wind direction to accurately drop the bombs. It was also highly secretive. The bombardiers had to take an oath to defend it with their life. But little did the U.S. know at the time that the Germans had a spy in the Norden bomb site factory, Hermann Lang, and they knew all about the Norden bomb site. Here you see the bombardier looking through his, the crosshairs of the bomb site, and then once he released the bombs, he would yell, "Bombs away!" And that would signal the first pilot to take control of the plane back, and then make a big turn and go to another pre-designated point called the rally point, where the bombers that made it through the formation would try to form up and make it back to their bases in England. But once again, they would have to face enemy fighters. And even when they did get back to England, they faced all sorts of dangers. The coast could be socked in and they couldn't even find their bases. They could be running out of fuel, there could be dead or injured pilots on the plane. The plane could have suffered a lot of battle damage, engines out, flight controls out, landing gear out. And so crash landings were very frequent, where more airmen lost their lives. It was on a bombing mission to Frankfurt, Germany on February 8th of 1944 when my dad's plane, the Susan Ruth, dropped its bomb successfully. But the bombarders got hit by flak and they couldn't get him back up. And as a result, that caused a drag in the plane. They lost airspeed and they started lagging behind the formation going back to England. And they were singled out by two German Focke-Wulf 195s. And like wolves or lions, it's coming down on prey, they attacked the Susan Ruth in the ensuing air battle. The plane was shot down. But both those Focke-Wulf fighters were shot down too. One was piloted by Siegfried Merrick. His plane crashed and he died in the plane. And the other was piloted by Hans Berger, who was able to bail out. During my research, one day my wife Linda goes, "Why don't you try to find the German pilot that shot your dad down?" And I'm thinking, oh, she's so naive. She doesn't know what she's talking about. It's impossible. But like a good husband, I did what she told me to do, and I found. And fortunately for me, he became a translator after the war, so he spoke perfect English. And he told me that the gunners on my dad's plane shot him down at the same time he shot my dad down. They shot each other down. And he gave me some wonderful insight that's in the book about what it was like to go up against the 8th Air Force. I mentioned that the book goes into detail about what happened to each member of the crew. I don't have time to go into it today. You'll have to buy the book if you want to find that out. But after my dad bailed out, he came down in some trees right at the French-Belgian border. And his parachute got tangled up in the branches. He was dangling 20 feet off the ground and couldn't get down. But fortunately for him, a couple of young Belgian men, Henri Franklin and Raymond Duran, came to his rescue before the Germans got there. They went back to the Raymond house and got a ladder and a rope, and they helped him down this tree. And that's one of the guys that helped my dad down from the tree, Henri Franklin. He sent these pictures back to my dad after the war. And there's over 200 photographs in the book, so you can visualize everything you're reading about. Many taken by Belgian people in the war, either sent to my dad after the war or provided to me by Dr. Delahaye or Jacques Malone. This occurred like early afternoon. We told my dad to stay put and hide because they thought it was too dangerous to try to move him in daylight with German patrols combing the area looking for these guys who bailed out. But that night they came back and got him and they took him to the Brevin farmhouse. And that house was in Belgium, and those trees were in France, so it is right at the border. He stayed there one night only because, again, they thought it was too dangerous for him to stay there any longer with German patrols still in the area. So the next night, a Belgian customs officer, Paul Tilcan, came on a tandem bicycle to take him to a safer location. And they headed out that night. My dad said it was pitch black and rainy. And he had some shrapnel wounds in one leg, so he could only pedal with his good leg, and they came to a hill and had to get off the bike and just push it up the hill. When we got to the top of the hill, there was this cabaret or cafe. The lights were on, music was playing, people were laughing and dancing. This is what it looked like in 1994 when I was there. And all of a sudden, two German officers come walking out with these two young French girls. One of them comes up to my dad, puts his arm around him and asks for a light for a cigarette. Well, my dad's petrified. He can't speak German and he couldn't speak French at that time. But fortunately, Paul knew what they wanted and lit the guy's cigarette and let them go on their way. My dad said these two Germans were so drunk and too interested in these young French girls to pay much attention to a couple of guys pushing a bike up there. And after that, my dad was moved from place to place to place. How long he stayed in any given location depended on how brave the Belgian people were who lived there and how dangerous the Belgian underground thought it was for him to stay there. He might spend one night, he might spend 6 weeks. Here you see some of the people that helped my dad. He had many more helpers than this. But this gives you a little idea of some of them. You can see my dad there on the left that tried to put a beret on him to try to help him blend in with the locals. But at 6'3", he was quite a bit taller than they were. And the Belgian people who hid my dad, or any down there for that matter, were unbelievably brave people. They risked not only their lives, but the lives of their family and friends because of the German secret police that Gestapo found out about it. They'd be arrested, sent to prison, tortured, either shot or sent to a concentration camp. And some of the Belgian people that helped my dad and other members of his crew did meet that fate. Here you see a couple of women that my dad stayed with for lengthy periods of time. On the left is Ghislaine Bailey. It was with her and her husband Maurice that he wrote his diary. And on the right is Jeanette Gadin. Her husband was actually a captain in the French army. He was captured in 1940 when Germany first invaded the lowlands, and he spent the remainder of the war as a POW. Normally, when the underground came across down airmen, they tried to get them back to England through various escape routes, down through France, into Spain, and over the Pyrenees into Spain, and out through British-controlled Gibraltar. But something always went wrong trying to get my dad in these networks. They often got compromised by collaborators, or they're caught, and people were killed. And he was getting quite frustrated with that, and also it was really stressful being hidden. You know, to begin with, here he is, you know, he's trying to get home, and his plane's attacked, it's on fire, he has to bail out, comes down in a foreign country, has no idea where he is, doesn't know what happened to his buddies in the crew, can't communicate with the U.S. military. He's being held by total strangers, and they can't even communicate. My dad has a little French English dictionary that escape kit they try to refer to. But communication was very hard, and any of these people could be a collaborator and turn them over to the Germans. And he had several close calls while he was hiding that they described in the book. One of them was when he was at the Bayou House in Charleroi. At night there was loud pounding on the door, and Maurice told him to get up on the roof. And then when the Germans left the area, he'd come get him. Well, the Germans never left the area. My dad spent all night on that roof, and this is not a good picture of the house. There's an attic, and there's a little tiny window you have to squeeze through to get up on the roof. And the roof is a steeply slanted tile roof. I mean, it'd be treacherous just getting up there. And I've been in that house and been all these places where his dad was hidden. Finally, my dad got tired of hiding. Word came that the Allies landed at Normandy on June 6th, and he decided to get back in the fight and join the French resistance. Well, my dad's helpers were aghast at that. They said, you know, they tried to talk him out of it because it'd be too dangerous. You could die fighting against the Germans, or if they caught you, you'd be shot on the spot as a terrorist. But my dad thought, you know, the Americans had landed, and there's guys fighting, and, you know, and risking their lives, and he should do the same thing. Unlike most airmen, he did have a year's experience in the infantry, so he knew how to fight on the ground. So he convinced one of his helpers, Annie Cools, to escort him down to the French border. They rode bicycles down there, and he joined a unit of the French resistance. This is not the group he joined, but it gives you an idea of what they look like. The French resistance, also referred to as the Maquis, were small, independent, ragtag guerrilla groups located all across France. Their job was just to harass the Germans. They would disrupt communications, sabotage railroad lines, assassinate German officers, attack convoys. And they got their instructions from the British through coded messages over the BBC. And my dad said the information they gave him was unbelievably accurate. They said a German patrol was coming down this road at this time, and on this day, sure enough, they'd show up. And that was a result of the British cracking the German Enigma code and knowing all about what the Germans were up to. They stayed in this farmhouse just across the border in France, in Waller's France. Here you see my dad standing in front of it in 1994. And he stayed in that tower. You see those two windows. On one occasion, it was early morning, he just had his skivvies on and shaving cream on his face, and he looks out, and a German patrol comes up the road. So he jumped out of these green windows from the back of the building and hightailed it into the woods before being captured. And the book goes into several encounters that the Maquis group had with the Germans, which were pretty thrilling. Finally, 7 months, well, let me show you this one. Who took this picture and how it got back to my dad, I'll never know. But that's him fighting with the French resistance in 1944. Finally, 7 months after bailing out, word came that there were U.S. troops in a nearby village of Trelone, France. So he walked into the village, went up to an army major in the town square, identified himself. They said who he was, and then he got a ride on a transport, or a convoy actually, taking German prisoners to Paris. And then from there, he hopped on a transport and got back to England, where he sent a Western Union telegram to my mother saying, "Fit as a fiddle, baby, back at base." Bank the money, honey, because they had all that back pay. Belgium is a wonderful little country. A lot of people don't realize it's really divided in two. The upper portion of Belgium is called Flanders, where they speak a dialect of Dutch, Flemish, and it's industrial and more heavily populated. And then the lower half of Belgium is called Wallonia, where they speak French, and it's all rural farmland there. And my dad and the plane, and the other guys who were able to bail out came down right around here. Actually, my dad and the plane came down in Belgium, and the other guys who were able to bail out came down in France, and they were brought across the border into Belgium either by Germans who captured them or by the French resistance who picked them up. And to this day, the Belgian people are still unbelievably thankful and grateful for the Americans coming to their rescue and the Allies and liberating them from 4 years of Nazi oppression and Nazi occupation. And they do a great job of educating the younger generations as well. Dr. Delahaye formed the Belgium American Foundation in 1984 and started building memorials to various events that took place. There are several memorials related to the shot down story, where they have ceremonies on the anniversary of those events every year. But the big celebrations are always centered around September 2nd, which is the anniversary of the liberation of Belgium. And they're wonderful events. They last several days. This is the poster from the celebrations in the 70th anniversary. They erect these big tents. This is just part of one. They seat hundreds of people. And they're really fun. There's band concerts and dances and lunches and dinners. And the locals dress up in period costumes. And the local beer, Chimay, just flows. And everyone has a great time. But they do have more solemn occasions where they have ceremonies at various memorials. This is the memorial at Cendron, which is right at the French-Belgian border, where the U.S. 9th Infantry first crossed over from the Wartros River from France into Belgium to liberate the country. And all the villagers would come out, the dignitaries make speeches, the U.S. military is there, Belgian military, French military, the U.S. ambassador to France comes down with an entourage. And they're really special events. And again, you see all these young people sitting in front to emphasize the importance of these events. Like most World War II veterans, my dad didn't talk a lot about the war until 1989, when a memorial was built to my dad and his crew. And my dad and the 3 other crewmen that were still living at the time went over for the dedication. And my dad was reunited with all these Belgian people that hit him, revisited his places where he stayed, and that brought it all back, and he started talking about it after that. Here you see the dedication ceremonies. The man on the left of the beard, that's Dr. Delahaye. Then my dad, who's making a speech. Then the woman in the rain court, that's Jeanette Godin, who I showed you in an earlier photo. And then the older woman is Nellie Tilcan. She was the wife of the Belgian customs officer, Paul Tilcan. A couple months after he helped my dad, he was arrested by the Gestapo and sent to prison and tortured, and narrowly escaped being executed. But because of the beatings he took on his head, he developed a brain tumor and died at age 51. And then a man in a trench coat, that's the other man who helped my dad down from the trees, Raymond Duvan. And 5 years later, I made my first trip to Belgium with my parents in 1994. And that's when it became personal for me, because my dad took me around all these places. Then you see me on the left, and my dad and my mother. And then the woman on the right is actually my other sister, Nancy, who was born when my dad was missing in action. So that was really tough on my mom, being back in Pasadena with 1-year-old Susan and infant Nancy, never knowing if she'd see her husband again. On 2 occasions to Belgium, I continued on to Munich, Germany, to visit Hans Berger, that Luftwaffe pilot that shot down my dad's plane, and we became friends. Here we are at his apartment in Munich. He's wearing his fighter jacket, his Iron Cross. He shot down 7 B-17s and 1 Spitfire. And he was shot down 3 times himself. Almost all his buddies in the Luftwaffe were killed during the war. The only reason I think he made it was because they took him out of combat in the beginning of 1945 to become a test pilot for the Henkel HE-162 single-engine jet fighter that the Germans were trying to perfect, which they never did. But, and he said, you know, it's too bad they had to be shooting at each other, but that was war. You know, he was pretty much like the U.S. Airmen, 19, 20-year-old guys, you know, trying to, you know, serve his country, trying to stay alive. And I had the interview that I did with him and filmed, and then he goes, "We weren't all evil Nazis." And then you see us at the Hofbrau house. He died a couple of years ago at 81. And this is my dad and I in 2004. It was right before the official dedication of the World War II Memorial. He wanted to go see it before he died. So I accompanied him on a reunion to the 8th Air Force Escape and Invasion Society. And we went down to the memorial. And that was the last trip he ever took. My dad was the last crewman to die, but he was the oldest in 91. And today, all the World War II vets are over 100. At one time, there were 16 million veterans. And as you can see from this graph, that's dwindled quite a bit. Today, there's less than 0.5% of these men still with us. There was no other event in history that affected more people than World War II. 60 million people died, and millions more were wounded, and millions more were displaced. It changed the course of America and the world forever. And in my opinion, the brave young men who fought and sacrificed are without doubt the greatest generation. And it's our duty to be young. Thank you.
Before Steve takes questions from you, I'd like for him to tell one story that I read at the end of the book. It was one of my favorite stories in the book, and it has to do with his father's parachute.
Well, I'll step back a minute. One day, my dad got a letter in the mail from Paul Delahaye. He had no idea who this guy was. And they invited him to come to a dedication ceremony for a memorial they were building to the first 12 GIs who were killed in the liberation of Belgium. And so I was talking it over with my mother and go, well, I don't even know who this guy is. I don't know if she go or not, you know, and they're debating. And then he got another letter from Dr. Delahaye that had the program of the events. My dad was listed as the keynote speaker. So he says, okay, Ruth, I guess we gotta go now. And when they went back there, Jeanette Godin, who I showed you in those films, she was still alive at that time. She was wearing a dress made out of a parachute in my dad's plane.
We can take a few questions, and then Steve's going to be in the back selling an incredible book. As I said, I've read it. You won't be able to put it down. It's just all the stories that are in there he just didn't have time to talk about today. So first question, yes.
What's the price of your book, and do you take a credit card?
The price of the book is $25, and yes, I take credit. One thing I'll mention that after my dad got back to England, they sent him home. They had a rule in the Air Force that if you were shot down and aided by the underground, then you couldn't go back into combat. Because they thought if you were shot down a second time, captured by the Germans or tortured, then you give up the identity of the people who had helped you the first time. The only exception to that was Chuck Yeager, who personally met with General Eisenhower, talked him into going back into combat. So my dad went back to the States and he became a B-17 flight instructor after that, till the end of the war.
The question is, did we lose more men in the air or on the ground during World War II?
Well, on the ground, yeah. But if you compare the number killed to the number who were flying, to the number killed or the number on the ground, you know, the ratio is a lot different, a lot higher in the 8th Air Force.